Hello, everybody. I'm Steve Orleans, president of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, and I'm thrilled today to be joined by my old friend, Michael Swaine, and a new friend, Rachel Odell. Michael has been as far back as I can remember, has been one of America's leading experts on U.S. China relations for most of the last, I guess, 2 decades. He was at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, part of their Asia effort. And recently, I guess within the last year, Michael joined the Quincy Institute, which is a new think tank. Rachel is a fairly recent PhD from MIT, who then went to Harvard and now is part of the Quincy Institute's new effort with regard to international relations. The full name, I should say, is the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. I've done many programs with Michael over many years. This one is driven by a piece that he wrote on the Strategic Competition Act, the act that has just recently passed the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and tries to reset what we're doing vis-a-vis China. So let me start, Michael or Rachel, whoever wants to take the first question. Give us a summary of the act, kind of its good parts, its bad parts. Obviously, you in the headline, you call it a declaration of a new Cold War with China. Obviously, you don't much like the act, but there are some things in the act that are decent. So give us a summary and then we'll get into questions. But thank you both for writing what you write and participating in this program.
Well, thanks, Steve. That's great. Really a pleasure to be with you again and to see you again, if just virtually. And really great that you responded to that piece that I wrote. And we've got more pieces that we wrote on the Responsible Statecraft website about this piece of legislation. It's really important to understand, and Rachel's going to add some points in a second, that this is part of a very large process, this bill, which is S1169, Senate bill. It's part of a larger process that's going on within both the Senate and the House to create a single large China-related bill that will also be addressing issues like technology, competition, and innovation, and those sorts of things. But it's on a very relatively fast track. It's pushed very strong by both Schumer and Pelosi, and it's now going through revision. And there's also, thus far, a sort of House version of this as well. And it's really, as you've indicated, I mean, it's a mix of good and bad. There are some things in there about U.S. competition and the need to improve it that are good, but there are a lot of bad things at least in the version that we had responded to at this point. Its overall tone very sort of Cold War-like, very zero-sum, sort of demonization, hair on fire kind of things about China's motives and policies, what's required to compete with China. It's not binding as well, I should say it's not all binding as this sort of legislation is. It's not really going to necessarily force the administration to do everything it has in there. Some of it's non-binding, but there are binding sections that if they last would not be good for either the United States or for U.S. China relations. But let me stop there and ask Rachel to add a couple of comments about this too.
Yeah, thanks. So I think to Michael's point, the Senate is a little bit further along in this process, and really the Strategic Competition Act is just one piece of a broader package of bills that are being kludged together under the name of a China legislation effort. And so the Strategic Competition Act came out of the Foreign Relations Committee. That's what we really focused on because it has a lot of concerning provisions. It's being attached to what's called the Endless Frontiers Act, which is really mostly about an American industrial policy, essentially, and investments in research and development. And there's a lot of positive dimensions to that. But the Strategic Competition Act, in addition to a lot of findings and senses of Congress that sort of, oftentimes without a lot of evidence, sort of present the most extreme characterizations of Chinese behavior that exist in the sort of think tank ecosystem. It also has some provisions, for example, one on Taiwan that would prohibit the US government from imposing any restrictions on official contacts between Taiwan government officials and the US government. And it would it would, impose another a, a review mechanism for educational exchanges, gifts, and contracts that are over a certain amount in sort of critical technology areas, not super well defined. It would subject them to CFIUS review, sort of securitizing in these educational exchanges. There's ways in which it directs the United States to sort of counter the Belt and Road Initiative around the world. So there's a lot of these concerning provisions. As far as positive provisions, I'd say,
let's stay on the negative for a second.
Great.
And then we'll go to the positive. I mean, partly, we seem to have had a problem in U.S. universities of disclosing gifts from non-U.S. sources. Now, the Quincy Institute, like us, does not take, we're quite careful not to take foreign money, not Chinese money, not French money, not Italian money. We don't take it. So isn't kind of the review of these grants being made to universities a okay thing?
So I think the first thing is that this particular provision in the Strategic Competition Act is not the right way to do it. I think there's certainly room for somewhat more oversight in highly critical or sensitive technologies, but this isn't, first of all, it's not only applying to China, it's applying to any foreign government, which in some ways it's good. You don't want a China specific approach. You want a more, country neutral approach in general, but it's actually having this perverse effect of sort of potentially chilling educational exchanges more generally beyond just with China. And so I think that the danger is that in
does it apply to exchanges or grants?
It's gifts over $1 million or contracts they're worth over $1 million, and within a certain time period, and in critical technology areas. So the problem here is that it's subjecting it to CFIUS review, which is not a body, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which is not a body that's really super familiar with higher education, that's well optimized to be able to evaluate these kinds of contracts and exchanges, and it really sort of puts a default assumption that these kinds of exchanges are a potential national security threat, as opposed to acknowledging that international scientific exchange is really critical for progress in combating things like climate change and pandemics. And so I think that there are alternative proposals out there, something that's come out of the Senate Homeland Security Committee that would have different review mechanisms that might be a little bit better, but I still have some concerns that, overly securitizing educational exchanges could have a chilling effect. And certainly, universities need to be stakeholders in crafting those bills.
Yeah. Besides the Taiwan provision, which sounds like it could really bring the whole house of cards of U.S.-China relations down. It's as Michael knows, I worked on the establishment of diplomatic relations in the 70s, and that is kind of fundamental to the basis upon which we established diplomatic relations. Besides that, what else is binding? That the tone stuff. I mean, Congress is screaming at China all the time. There are hundreds of bills which have this demonization of China, but they're more or less, they don't do much. What else in the bill is binding that's going to create problems?
Besides Taiwan and this issue of review, CFIUS review, I'm not aware of what else in there that is binding that would be truly as damaging as those two things would be. But Rachel, do you have others in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's another area that's of particular concern is there's this bill on countering the CCP's malign influence that's sort of embedded as one of the sections in the Strategic Competition Act. And it entails authorization of a large fund it's not very specific how it should be used, but in general, it's designed to sort of for the U.S. government to use this in countering China's malign influence, which, I think I've written about. I also wrote about this for Responsible Statecraft with a colleague. I think there are certain areas in which, of course, the United States does need to counter certain efforts by the Chinese government that are, threats to U.S. security or that are, undermining civil society in the United States. But I think that the approach that this bill takes is it's not very differentiated. It doesn't really clearly define malign influence, and there's a real danger that risk casting aspersions on a lot of positive U.S.-China exchange. And so I think that just creating this big slush fund for countering Chinese influence has a real danger of exacerbating anti-Asian racism and weakening the foundations of healthy U.S.-China relations.
Is it to some degree though, but so the US government or Congress, the executive branch, a number of think tanks have this exaggerated fear of the Confucius Institutes around the country. And they've been a source of Chinese language training for Americans. And I think the three of us and most people, even who disagree with our views, think training Americans in Chinese language is a good thing. So is some of this money intended to kind of teach Chinese language because we're going to cut off the funding from Confucius Institutes on that?
So this particular fund that I'm referring to doesn't have anything earmarked specifically for that. So, there are some sort of positive exchanges. It establishes in another section, a Taiwan fellowship program that involves some language training, but I don't think there's any serious effort entailed in this bill to provide alternative language training for the Confucius Institutes that could really replace them, even though I think it would be great if we would invest more in that.
Michael, did you get your Chinese language training in Taiwan like I did?
I did indeed at the Stanford Center.
And I got it at Shifan Daxue.
Okay.
So it may be an interesting circle that we're going through, that we may go back to the time when Michael and I started our study of Chinese. What's good in the bill?
Well, I think this Taiwan Fellowship Program is one of those examples. I think it's a positive way of strengthening U.S.-Taiwan relations without undermining, the one China policy and the stable framework for the relationship that's existed a long time. There's also a provision on anti-Asian racism that actually recently passed independently, a version of that passed Congress. So, but that's in there. And there's some components about enhancing security cooperation with other countries in Asia. There's something in there on the need for enhancing U.S.-China nuclear dialogue. So there's a few positive provisions, but they're somewhat swamped by the more negative ones.
I think I should just add, Steve, that even though it's not binding per se, if they find their way into the final version, it really does establish a kind of bottom line and a mindset as if to say, this is what the Congress thinks about China. And it defines that if it follows through from what's in the Strategic Competition Act, it defines that in such a extreme zero-sum kind of confrontational way that it would, I think, really suppress abilities of members and others to be able to define the goals of the United States vis-a-vis China in ways that are not that, that don't simply reinforce that tone, that mindset within this bill. And in that sense, it's I think more potentially important than just this past or past individual pieces of legislation, which might be much narrower. It's going to be a very broad-based, very sweeping piece of legislation.
And I will just note that there are a lot of binding parts. I mean, it's a very long bill, hundreds of pages, so we're not intimately familiar with every part of it, and
right.
and not even mentioning all of them. Another one is there's a section on security cooperation that calls for, and this is one of those things that it probably wouldn't be super binding if the executive branch didn't want to do it, but it calls for joint exercising with Taiwan, with the Taiwan military, and for supporting Taiwan and acquiring long-range precision fires and capabilities that aren't super defensive in nature. And so there are many other offensive provisions in the bill, and that's just one of them. And in some ways, the bill is structured like a Cold War style approach because it goes through each region of the world and what the United States needs to do to counter China in those regions. So yeah, there's a lot of problems.
I should just add that the administration, from what I can understand, has been, of course, talking with the committees involved in this, and it's the impression that we have that they're certainly not happy with some of the language that's in there, and particularly with regard to Taiwan.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be surprised if there will be pullback on the characterization of the importance of Taiwan to the United States, which is defined in the Strategic Competition Act originally as part of America's Indo-Pacific strategy, Taiwan. And then there's a section that describes how important Taiwan is to the first island chain defense. So it basically tries to sort of set up Taiwan as a strategic asset for the United States, which if you carry that through, I mean, that would fundamentally undermine the one China policy. It would basically say the United States should not be in support of a peaceful, uncoerced resolution of this problem through unification, because we don't want the Chinese to have control over Taiwan for strategic reasons. And that, I think, if it really did carry through, and if it really did influence more legislation in terms of lowering barriers to dealing with Taiwan in a various ways, mill and otherwise, you could see a significant impact. Now, I don't think the Biden administration wants to go down that route at this time, and I think they push back against it. But that misunderstanding of the nature of U.S. policy is in there.
I guess that's somewhat related to my next question, which is, we thought the Hill was more negative, more looking for a new Cold War, but last night we heard the era of constructive engagement with China is over. How different is the executive branch view from the congressional view now? And maybe this bill does represent what the executive branch is thinking.
Well, I think in terms of basic approach, basic assessment as to the fact that China is a dire threat to the United States, I don't think they use the term existential threat in the legislation, and the administration has not recently used this. But I think there's a lot of overlap in how they look at China and what it represents to the United States. I think the Biden administration is less extreme in its characterization of specific differences with Beijing. And I think it's more marginally receptive to trying to cooperate with Beijing in certain areas, despite what Kurt Campbell has just said about the era of engagement being over. The State Department itself has already issued statements that indicate that it has to be able to engage with the Chinese in a variety of different areas. I mean, this was in fact, Steve, something that even the Trump administration referred to. The Trump administration, in its 2020 strategic analysis of China, stated that the United States must engage China in a variety of different ways. So to make this kind of blanket statement that it's, the administration, that the era of engagement is over, I think is too much. I mean, it's extreme, and it's not certainly in line with the interests of the United States, in my view. So I think that the approach is a little bit more pragmatic. The approach is less ideological than you get on the Hill, but you've still got fundamental problems here with how the administration is going to deal with China, not just from the point of view of sort of zero-sum competition, but from the point of view of the areas of constructive competition that could occur. Where do you really need to be able to have serious cooperation, and how do you go about doing that when you're sort of demonizing large parts of China or the Chinese leadership at the same time? I mean, they haven't really addressed any of these issues in any real meaningful way. They're doing a China policy review, as you I'm sure know, at this point in time. I doubt very much there's going to be many surprises in it. I think you'll get versions of what you've heard already and from Kurt Campbell and others. So to me, there are distinctions that are less hair on fire kind of thing in the Biden administration's approach to the issue, but I still think that the overlap is very, very significant.
One thing I think that's actually interesting to note is that just this week, the House Foreign Affairs Committee chair, Congressman Meeks from New York, he issued his version of a China bill that would be sort of the House counterpart to the Strategic Competition Act. It's called the EAGLE Act. I think it's the Expanding American Global Leadership and Engagement Act. And it borrows some components of the Strategic Competition Act, but it really adopts a very different tone, a much more measured tone. And it cuts a lot of the findings I was referring to that are sort of the most extreme characterizations of China's intentions and behavior. And it really tones down a lot of the language about how the whole whole of government effort needs to be organized around countering China. That's in the Senate version. It's not in the House version. And it does call for cooperation with China on things like climate change and global financial stability and nuclear security. So it still has, if I had my druthers, I still think that it's not a necessary bill, just given that it has a lot of these, some things in common with the Strategic Competition Act, but it keeps the positive things and gets rid of a lot of the negative things. So I think even on the Hill, there is some variation, and more of a desire to have a more positive approach to the relationship that's, yes, competitive, but still constructive.
I mean, I totally agree with Rachel on this, Steve. We need to be a little cautious about, we don't want to just simply assume everybody on the Hill is kind of, hair on fire. There are people in both the House and in the Senate who are very concerned about the direction of US policy in general, and the tone and the characterization, both in this legislation that we're talking about and elsewhere. The Meeks bill is really his bill, and it's not sort of the House Foreign Affairs Committee's bill at this point. It's his opening bid, as we see it, in the dialogue with the Republicans in the House side, to try and get some kind of alternative language and wording there that the Republicans and the House and the Democrats can live with, and then take that to the Senate side and then work through reconciliation.
Well, that was going to be my next question, which is, what's process going forward? When does this make it? What's the likelihood of it make it? And when would it kind of enter into law? We've seen the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesman already, criticizing it strongly.
Yeah, so actually today, I mean, it's a very live process on the Senate side, and they've been voting on amendments the last few days. Again, the Strategic Competition Act is part of a much broader package of a whole number of bills, and a lot of them are not just, the Strategic Competition Act has in some ways been less controversial than other parts of this that focus on the economic relationship and economic investments in the US. And so there's been a lot of haggling and negotiating over that. And I believe that about an hour ago, a cloture vote passed to close a debate and amendments on the bill. So I think that means that they'll vote on this broader package, which is called the Innovation and Competition Act, by the end of the week in the Senate, and it's likely to pass past the filibuster proof threshold, 60 votes or more. So, and it just really is, they're trying to get this bipartisan win. And so that's been Schumer's big emphasis. Now, on the House side, though, the process is much less further along. They're still in the stage of getting all the different committees to prepare their components for this package. And the EAGLE Act I mentioned from the House Foreign Affairs Committee chair would be what the Democratic chair of that committee wants to contribute. But even the committees still have to negotiate their pieces of the package. Then it has to get packaged together by House leadership. And, so all these committees have to do markups and have to pass out of committee. Then there has to be overall votes and amendments on the floor of the full House. And so that, I would guess, and it's recessed next week. So I think we probably still have a few weeks before you see anything coming out of the House, at least. And then they'll have to go through reconciliation process. So I think there's good chances that something will pass sometime this summer. And, in terms of, I'm not sure exactly of when it would go, when the effective date is, and different components of the package would go into effect at different times too.
Yeah. I was interested, there was a provision, I, like you, have not looked at every provision, but there was a provision relating to intellectual property theft and the need to kind of just keep a public list of where US courts have found there's been intellectual property theft, where there's been coercion to turn over intellectual property. And I actually think that's a good thing. And I think it's a good thing because when you listen to administrative, especially previous administration officials, they talked about trillions of dollars of intellectual property theft. And I used to say, show me where. Tell me the companies. So in a lot of ways, the disclosure would show, yes, there is theft, but kind of what Michael's saying, it's not hair on fire. It's not beyond comprehension. It's right. Actually quite limited, and China's indigenous innovation is now much more serious than much more competent than what we used to think it was.
Well, of course, a lot of it depends on the details and how you define intellectual property theft and how important it is and who's going to have oversight on this process of identifying it. It's subject to all kinds of political chicanery. of one sort or another, I think. But I definitely share your views, Steve. I think a lot of the assessments that we've heard in the past about intellectual property theft have come out of reports on the broad question, which used to assess $600 billion per year. Now, people didn't recognize that that was a total assessment for all intellectual property by all countries. People tended to assume that was China. And if they didn't, they said, well, the vast majority of it is China. And then you say, well, where do you make that breakdown? Where does that come from? And the answer is almost always, in fact, I've never seen an exception, it's classified.
Yeah. Yeah, I always go to the footnotes when I see those statements, and the footnotes are not very useful, to put
If you
it
track it back through the footnotes, you'll find that the ultimate footnote usually is a classified document, so they don't give you a rationale openly.
Yeah. Even in the U.S. TR reports, they make, especially in the previous administration, there were conclusory statements, and when you went to the footnotes didn't particularly support the conclusory statement. So we're in this position. What legislation should we have? In other words, if you could somehow wave a magic wand and say, all right, this is the legislation we should have, or is the answer is the existing system is fine, the executive branch just needs to do a better job?
Well, I would say just a word, and I'll let Rachel answer this as well, that there certainly needs to be legislation, Steve, by the United States that incentivizes more domestic investment in areas where the U.S. needs to be more competitive. So these aspects of the Unlimited Frontiers Act and others that really want to identify and support R&D in high-tech areas that we all know are going to be critical to the future, all those things are good. I think it's bad to frame all of that in terms of, oh my God, the Chinese are going to get us, so we've got to make this, because then everything becomes a question of countering the Chinese, and your assessment about what you need to do then becomes very, very narrow and very zero-sum. You close off the idea that, in fact, there are areas where you actually should compete, and not just compete, but cooperate with the Chinese on technology. I mean, they're a major tech player. Not everything they're doing in technology is related to national security. So I think you need that kind of legislation, and you need to avoid framing it in that anti-China way. And you need legislation that really does more right-size the threat of what is the nature of the threat to the United States by China in terms of actual threat about certain uncertainties in the future, which often gets mixed up. It's not a clear threat, but it could become under a worst case situation. But you don't want to assume that that is in fact the case. So you want to make that sort of qualification. Rachel, do you have anything to add?
I agree with all that. I think the only thing I would add is that, yes, the executive branch does need to do better. There are things that, in an ideal world, the legislature could be calling for that would be more constructive. They have a lot of things where they're trying to sort of guide or, prod the executive branch in a certain direction that I don't think is very constructive. They could instead be calling the executive branch to, build better crisis management mechanisms with China, or to, do things like renew the U.S. China Clean Energy Research Fund that's expiring next year. I mean, there's a lot of positive ways they could contribute, but those are also things the executive branch could do on their own and needs to do. And I think there's actually a lot of ways in which the Trump administration, especially in the past year, took a lot of executive actions to really undermine the U.S.-China relationship, and people-to-people exchanges, and journalistic exchanges, and scientific collaboration, things like the Peace Corps and Fulbright programs. A lot of these kinds of measures, vast majority of which have not been reversed yet by the Biden administration, but which easily could be. And I think they need to take more action.
We're out of time. So, and you've raised a question which we could do a whole separate program on, Rachel, which is, why have they failed to reverse? Why has the Biden administration not reversed some of these policies which don't really do anything to hurt the Chinese, but really hurt the American people, hurt academics, hurt exchanges, hurt the working families of the United States? I mean, finally, Catherine Tai is speaking to Leoha. These tariffs are really, hurting the American people. And mostly, the worst part about it is it really hurts working class families. Rich people, people in government, they don't much notice the effect of the tariffs, whereas poorer families, working families do. And it strikes me, and Biden in the campaign had talked about this, but it's again, I don't count 120 days since that they've been in office. They've been in the office effectively for 6.5 months. Once the election was decided, they knew they were going to be able to implement these policies, and they're not being implemented. So why is that? Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that at least with a lot of the people exchanges I mentioned, I think their calculation is probably right now we're still in the middle of a pandemic. We wouldn't be actually having these exchanges anyway, even if they hadn't been banned by the Trump administration because of that. So they don't feel that urgency to restore a lot of the connections. And so I think then the domestic political calculations come in and they figure, well, right now we want to be tough on China. We don't want to be taking too many hits from the Republican side. And so why do these things that, maybe eventually we'll get to them, but, it just would give them more ammunition to call him China Joe or Beijing Biden, which, let's be real, they're going to do that no matter what. But I think that's, I think that's the basic calculation on a lot of it.
It's very clear, Stephen, I think where they are and where they want to go here, the Biden administration. They're emphasizing domestic renewal, domestic improvement, improving with allies, improving relations with allies. And all of that is basically not directed specifically at the Chinese, but it's all implicated with the Chinese. And they want to be able to advance all of those areas and then be able to then say, okay, now we'll deal with the Chinese from a position of strength, which is what Biden has already said. So we shouldn't be out there signaling that we want to improve relations with China right now, because we want to really make it very clear to the Chinese that what we say has a lot of backing behind it. And politically, that's important for them in dealing with the allies, and it's very important for them in dealing with the Republicans. And I think that's what explains a lot of it.
And do you think that's a correct calculation?
I think you can't just put the China relationship on hold while you're moving along in these other areas to try to improve your leverage in some ways. You've got to be able to understand clearly what it is you want and where and how you need to be able to engage with the Chinese. This idea of no engagement is just nonsense, of course. And you need to be able to then set up what other parameters, what kind of policies are you going to be implementing? And you have to be able to do that through some level of engagement with the Chinese. You can't just all predicate it on, we're going to set up what we want. We know what we want. We just need to get outside backing, and then we'll go to the Chinese. Mm-hmm. So I do think it's wrong in that sense. And I think it's wrong in that it also would possibly try to move the allies and friends and partners in directions that they're not comfortable going. I think they look at something like the Strategic Competition Act, and my guess is a lot of them are not reassured by it. They're bothered by it. Even though the administration, a lot of Washington say, oh, this is what the allies want. We have to be tougher with China. Well, yes and no. Isn't that your reaction too, Stephen, talking to people or in different, yes. I get contacted by embassies and others who want to talk to me about this whole issue of U.S. policy and where it's going. What are the objectives here other than we need to win a competition? How does that really relate to the overall interest we have with the Chinese? Where do we balance in these areas between the different functions and purposes we want? None of that is being convincingly, in my view, presented by the U.S. administration.
I think Michael, your analysis is correct. What troubles me, and I guess partly because I spent my life in business, not in U.S. China business, but in business, but there's an assumption of a static quality that is simply wrong. It's always moving. That's number one. Number two, markets, when someone changes, when behavior changes, it doesn't change temporarily, it changes permanently. So I was talking to a manufacturer with the tariffs still in place who said, I got to sell to China, I got to sell to the United States. But with these tariffs in place, I'm locating in Canada or Mexico. I can sell into the United States with no tariffs, and I can sell to China with no tariffs. That decision, which is now made, is not going to be reversed. They're not going to sit there and close the Canadian facility and say, the tariffs are gone now. So it's a slow, it's a drip, drip, drip. And these delistings trouble me deeply because they don't hurt the Chinese companies, but they do hurt employment in the United States, especially in my hometown, New York City. But these companies just list in Hong Kong, Singapore, Tokyo. They
Right.
don't sit there and go home and say we can only we can only list in China. They just list elsewhere. So we like are playing whack-a-mole. So we whack them in New York and they just turn up elsewhere. So
Yeah.
I don't understand. Now, maybe I'm told this may reverse very soon, but I don't understand why on January 21st that wasn't reversed. It
Right.
just hurts Americans. And I guess it's exactly the point that you and Rachel make, which is they need to kind of have a relationship with folks on the Hill and have a consensus on what they should do. We're way out of time now. We're way over, but Michael, Rachel, thank you so much. We will have to do this again when and if the Strategic Competition Act becomes law, because it will have lots of implications for all of our work, how we live every day in the American people. But I thank you so much. We're happy. This is, I think, the first program we've done since you joined the Quincy Institute. Pleased to see it playing an important role, and it's going to be an important voice going forward. So thank you
so much, Stephen. Really appreciate the invitation to talk with you today, and hope we have more such conversations in the future. Thank you.
Will do.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks all.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.